The moment Margaret Williams stepped into the ornate cathedral, wearing her carefully chosen navy dress and matching shoes, she never imagined that within 30 minutes she would become the target of whispered insults and cruel laughter from people she had hoped would welcome her as family. What started as the most joyful day of her life, watching her beloved daughter Rachel walk down the aisle, would transform into a humiliating nightmare that would test every ounce of dignity she had built over her 53 years of life. But sometimes, when we think we're at our lowest point, unexpected heroes emerge from the most surprising places to remind us that our worth cannot be diminished by small-minded people who mistake cruelty for superiority. Hi there, I'm Tina, and I want you to settle in with me today because the story I'm about to share will take you on an emotional journey that might just change how you see family dynamics and the power of standing up for what's right. Margaret's experience at her daughter's wedding reveals something profound about human nature, the way we treat people based on appearances and assumptions, and how one person's courage can shift an entire room's energy. If you've ever felt judged, excluded, or looked down upon by people who thought they were better than you, this story will resonate deeply with your heart. I promise you'll want to hear every detail of what happened when that priest finally spoke up. So please hit that like button to let me know you're here with me. And consider subscribing because I bring you real stories about real people navigating life's most challenging and transformative moments. Now, let me tell you about Margaret and how one wedding ceremony became a battlefield between kindness and cruelty. Margaret had been looking forward to Rachel's wedding for months, ever since her daughter had announced her engagement to Thomas Hamilton, a successful investment banker from one of the city's most prominent families. As a single mother who had worked double shifts as a night shift nurse for over 20 years to put Rachel through college and medical school, Margaret felt overwhelming pride knowing that her sacrifices had helped her daughter achieve her dreams and find love with someone who seemed to genuinely care for her happiness and future. The Hamilton family lived in an entirely different world from Margaret's modest apartment and secondhand furniture, but she had hoped that their shared love for Rachel would create common ground where social differences wouldn't matter. The wedding preparations had been a source of both excitement and anxiety for Margaret, who had spent weeks searching for the perfect outfit that would be appropriate for such a formal occasion without stretching her limited budget beyond its breaking point. She had finally found a beautiful navy dress at a consignment shop, paired it with shoes that matched perfectly, and even splurged on a small but elegant pearl necklace that had belonged to her own mother. When she looked at herself in the mirror that morning, Margaret felt confident and dignified, ready to celebrate her daughter's happiness, surrounded by people who would surely appreciate the remarkable young woman Rachel had become. The cathedral was breathtaking, with soaring ceilings, stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the stone floors, and floral arrangements that must have cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. As guests began arriving in their expensive cars and designer clothes, Margaret noticed the subtle but unmistakable differences between Rachel's friends and family versus Thomas's relatives and social circle. The Hamilton side of the aisle was filled with people who carried themselves with the confident ease that comes from generations of financial security and social privilege, while Margaret's small group of family members and friends seemed more subdued, clearly aware that they were entering unfamiliar territory. Margaret had met Thomas's parents, Robert and Patricia Hamilton, only twice before the wedding, during brief and somewhat awkward dinners where conversation had focused primarily on Thomas's career achievements and the couple's future plans. Patricia Hamilton was a polished woman in her early 60s who served on multiple charity boards and spoke with the kind of refined accent that suggested expensive private schools and exclusive social connections. Robert Hamilton was a distinguished-looking man who owned several successful businesses and had strong opinions about politics, economics, and what he considered appropriate behavior for people in different social circumstances. During those previous encounters, Margaret had sensed that the Hamiltons viewed her with a mixture of polite tolerance and barely concealed judgment, as if they were trying to determine whether she would be an embarrassment to their family's reputation. They had asked pointed questions about her background, her education, and her financial situation, framing their inquiries as friendly interest while making it clear that they were evaluating whether she met their standards for association with their social circle. Margaret had answered honestly about her work as a nurse and her pride in raising Rachel as a single mother, but she could see in their expressions that her life story didn't align with their expectations for their future daughter-in-law's family. The morning of the wedding, as Margaret took her seat in the designated area for the bride's family, she noticed several members of the Hamilton family glancing in her direction and whispering among themselves. At first, she assumed they were simply curious about meeting Rachel's relatives, but the nature of their glances seemed more critical than welcoming. Margaret tried to focus on the beautiful ceremony preparations and the joy of seeing her daughter about to marry the man she loved, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being scrutinized and found wanting by people who had decided her worth based on superficial observations. Patricia Hamilton's sister Victoria was particularly obvious in her assessment of Margaret, looking her up and down with the kind of critical examination usually reserved for inspecting merchandise before purchase. Victoria whispered something to the woman sitting next to her, and both of them looked at Margaret with expressions that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Margaret had spent her entire adult life proving that her value as a person had nothing to do with her bank account or social connections. But sitting in that cathedral surrounded by people who seemed determined to judge her based on those very criteria, she felt the familiar sting of class-based discrimination that she had hoped to leave behind. As more guests filled the cathedral, Margaret became increasingly aware of the whispered conversations and sideways glances directed toward her section of the church. Thomas's cousins, a group of well-dressed women in their 30s and 40s, had positioned themselves in the pew directly behind her, and their voices carried just enough for Margaret to catch fragments of their commentary about the bride's family and what they perceived as the obvious differences in social status between the two sides of the wedding party. Their tone was not kind, and Margaret felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as she realized that her presence was being discussed as if she were an unwelcome intrusion on an otherwise perfect society event. The cruelest comments came from Thomas's Aunt Caroline, a woman who had inherited significant wealth and seemed to believe that financial privilege automatically conferred moral superiority over people with less money. Caroline spoke in the kind of stage whisper that was clearly intended to be overheard, making observations about Margaret's dress, her shoes, and what she assumed about her background based on these superficial details. She commented that it was unfortunate when people didn't understand the importance of dressing appropriately for significant occasions, and that some families clearly needed guidance about proper behavior in refined social settings. Margaret's hands trembled as she heard Caroline speculate about whether Rachel had inherited her mother's lack of social awareness and whether Thomas truly understood what he was getting himself into by marrying into a family that obviously came from such different circumstances. The other Hamilton women laughed softly at Caroline's observations, creating a bubble of shared superiority that excluded and diminished everyone who didn't meet their arbitrary standards for acceptability. Margaret felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks as she sat alone in her designated spot, surrounded by people who seemed determined to make her feel unwelcome at her own daughter's wedding. The whispered insults continued as the ceremony preparations progressed, with various Hamilton family members contributing their own observations about Margaret's appearance, her presumed background, and what they saw as the unfortunate social mismatch between their refined family and Rachel's more humble origins. They spoke about her as if she couldn't hear them, as if her feelings didn't matter, as if her decades of hard work and sacrifice to raise an accomplished daughter meant nothing compared to their inherited advantages and social connections. Margaret tried to focus on the beauty of the cathedral, the elegant floral arrangements, and the anticipation of seeing Rachel in her wedding dress, but the constant stream of judgment and mockery made it impossible to enjoy what should have been one of the happiest moments of her life. She thought about all the nights she had worked extra shifts to pay for Rachel's education, all the times she had gone without new clothes or vacations so that her daughter could have opportunities that Margaret herself had never enjoyed. The idea that these people could dismiss her worth based on the price of her dress or the neighborhood where she lived felt like a knife twisting in her chest. The situation became even more unbearable when Patricia Hamilton herself joined the subtle campaign of exclusion and judgment, making comments about the importance of maintaining family standards and ensuring that new additions to their social circle understood the expectations that came with their elevated position in the community. She spoke about the challenges of integrating people from different backgrounds into established families, making it clear that she viewed Margaret as a potential source of embarrassment rather than a welcome addition to their extended family network. You know, dear friends, there are moments in life when we discover who we really are and what we're made of. And for Margaret, this was becoming one of those defining experiences. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where people judged you based on things that had nothing to do with your character or your heart? Have you ever felt the sting of being excluded or looked down upon by people who thought their circumstances made them better than you? I can feel Margaret's pain through every word of this story, and I know many of you have experienced similar moments of humiliation and judgment. The way we treat people when we think they're beneath us reveals everything about our own character, and the Hamilton family was showing their true colors in the cruelest possible way. As the ceremony was about to begin, Margaret made a decision that would have been easy to understand if she had chosen it. She considered quietly slipping out of the cathedral and watching from the parking lot, sparing herself further humiliation and avoiding any possibility that her presence might somehow diminish Rachel's special day. The whispered comments had become so persistent and cruel that Margaret felt like her very existence was being treated as an unfortunate mistake that needed to be hidden or corrected. She had spent her entire adult life working hard and treating people with dignity and respect, but none of that seemed to matter to people who measured human worth by bank account balances and social connections. But then Margaret thought about Rachel, radiant and happy, preparing to walk down the aisle to marry the man she loved, and she realized that leaving would mean allowing these small-minded people to drive her away from one of the most important moments in her daughter's life. Rachel had never been ashamed of her mother or their modest circumstances, had never asked Margaret to pretend to be someone she wasn't, and had always expressed gratitude for the sacrifices Margaret had made to give her opportunities for success and happiness. Walking away would mean that the Hamilton family's cruelty had succeeded in making Margaret feel so diminished that she couldn't even stay to witness her own daughter's wedding ceremony. So Margaret straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and decided to stay in her seat regardless of what these people thought or said about her. She had earned her place in that cathedral through decades of love, sacrifice, and devotion to Rachel's well-being, and no amount of whispered insults or social snobbery could diminish the value of what she had contributed to her daughter's life and success. The moment Rachel appeared at the back of the cathedral in her stunning white gown, the whispered commentary from the Hamilton family section temporarily ceased, as even the cruelest critics had to acknowledge the bride's radiant beauty and obvious happiness. Margaret felt her heart swell with overwhelming pride as she watched her daughter glide down the aisle with grace and confidence, every inch the accomplished woman she had worked so hard to raise. Rachel's smile was luminous, her posture perfect, and her joy absolutely infectious as she moved toward Thomas, who waited at the altar with an expression of complete adoration and love. For a few precious minutes, Margaret allowed herself to forget about the hostile whispers and cruel judgments surrounding her, focusing instead on the miracle of seeing her little girl transformed into a confident bride ready to begin the next chapter of her life. This was the moment Margaret had dreamed about during all those exhausting nights when she had come home from 12-hour shifts at the hospital, too tired to cook dinner, but still helping Rachel with homework and listening to her talk about her hopes and dreams for the future. Every sacrifice had been worth it to see Rachel standing at that altar, surrounded by love and preparing to marry a man who clearly cherished her. But as the ceremony progressed and the initial distraction of Rachel's entrance faded, the Hamilton family resumed their whispered campaign of exclusion and mockery with renewed vigor. Caroline had apparently decided that Margaret's emotional response to seeing her daughter was itself worthy of criticism, commenting that some people simply didn't understand the importance of maintaining composure during formal occasions. She suggested that emotional displays were inappropriate in refined social settings, as if Margaret's tears of joy and pride were somehow evidence of her unsuitability for association with their elevated social circle. The other Hamilton women chimed in with their own observations about what they perceived as Margaret's inadequate understanding of proper wedding etiquette, critiquing everything from her choice of tissues to the way she held her purse. They seemed determined to find fault with every aspect of her presence, as if documenting her perceived shortcomings would somehow validate their sense of superiority and justify their treatment of her as an unwelcome intruder at what should have been a celebration of love and family unity. Patricia Hamilton made a particularly cutting remark about the importance of ensuring that family photographs would properly represent their social standing, implying that Margaret's appearance might somehow diminish the quality and appropriateness of the wedding pictures that would be displayed in their home and shared with their social connections. The suggestion that Margaret's presence was something to be minimized or hidden in the official record of Rachel's wedding felt like the ultimate insult, a denial of her fundamental role in creating the remarkable woman who was standing at the altar. Thomas's grandmother, Eleanor Hamilton, joined the conversation with observations about the unfortunate tendency of some families to overreach their social position, creating awkward situations that reflected poorly on everyone involved. She spoke about the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between different social classes, as if mixing people from various backgrounds was inherently problematic rather than an opportunity for mutual enrichment and understanding. Her words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades believing that accident of birth determined human worth. The whispered commentary reached its cruelest peak when several Hamilton family members began speculating about whether Rachel had adequately prepared Thomas for the social challenges that would come with having Margaret as a mother-in-law. They discussed the potential embarrassment of future family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and social events where Margaret's presence might require them to explain or apologize for what they saw as her inadequate social credentials and inappropriate behavior. Margaret felt as if she were disappearing under the weight of their collective judgment, shrinking into herself as these people systematically dismantled her sense of dignity and worth through their relentless stream of criticism and exclusion. She had faced many challenges and hardships during her years as a single mother, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of deliberate social cruelty from people who seemed to take pleasure in making her feel unwelcome and ashamed of who she was and where she came from. The irony of the situation was not lost on Margaret, who realized that these people were demonstrating exactly the kind of character flaws and moral shortcomings that truly made someone unsuitable for polite society. Their willingness to mock and exclude a guest at a wedding celebration, their lack of basic kindness and empathy towards someone who had never done anything to harm them, and their apparent belief that financial advantage gave them the right to treat others with contempt, revealed a poverty of spirit that no amount of money or social status could disguise. As the ceremony continued, Margaret found herself thinking about all the Hamilton family members who were participating in this whispered campaign of judgment and exclusion. These were people who served on charity boards, who attended church regularly, who presented themselves as pillars of the community and examples of refined behavior and moral character. Yet here they sat, in a house of worship, during a celebration of love and commitment, choosing to spend their time tearing down someone whose only crime was loving her daughter enough to sacrifice everything for her success and happiness. The disconnect between their public personas and their private behavior was staggering, and Margaret realized that she was witnessing the kind of hypocrisy that often hides behind social privilege and inherited advantage. These people had learned to speak the language of charity and community service, but when faced with someone they perceived as beneath their social status, their true characters emerged in all their petty, cruel glory. But what Margaret didn't know, as she sat there absorbing wave after wave of whispered insults and social exclusion, was that someone else in that cathedral had been listening to the Hamilton family's behavior with growing disgust and determination to act. Father Michael O'Brien, the priest who was officiating the ceremony, had been serving this community for over 20 years, and he had developed a keen sense for recognizing the difference between genuine faith and superficial religious observance. Father O'Brien had been watching the Hamilton family's behavior with increasing concern throughout the pre-ceremony period, noticing the way they had isolated and targeted Margaret with their whispered comments and obvious exclusion. As a man who had dedicated his life to serving God and building communities based on love, compassion, and mutual respect, he found their treatment of a guest at a wedding ceremony deeply troubling and completely contrary to the values that should guide any gathering in a house of worship. He had officiated hundreds of weddings over the years, and he had learned to recognize when family dynamics were creating pain and division rather than celebration and unity. The priest had also observed Margaret's quiet dignity throughout the ordeal, noticing how she had chosen to remain in her seat despite the obvious hostility directed toward her, how she had maintained her composure while absorbing insult after insult, and how her focus had remained on celebrating her daughter's happiness even as others worked to diminish her presence and worth. Father O'Brien recognized the kind of strength and character that Margaret was displaying, and he felt compelled to address the stark contrast between her gracious behavior and the Hamilton family's cruel treatment of someone who deserved their welcome and respect. During the ceremony, as Thomas and Rachel exchanged vows that spoke of love, commitment, and the joining of two families, Father O'Brien made a decision that would transform the entire dynamic of the gathering. Instead of delivering the traditional homily about marriage and partnership that he had prepared, he chose to speak directly about the values that should guide families and communities, addressing the behavior he had witnessed with the kind of moral clarity that comes from years of spiritual leadership and deep understanding of human nature. Father O'Brien's voice carried clearly throughout the cathedral as he began to speak about the true meaning of family, explaining that families are not defined by wealth, social status, or material possessions, but by love, sacrifice, and unwavering support for each other's dreams and happiness. He spoke about parents who work multiple jobs to give their children opportunities for success, about the kind of selfless dedication that puts another person's well-being above personal comfort and convenience, and about the profound beauty of watching someone you love achieve their goals through your sacrifice and encouragement. As Father O'Brien continued his unexpected homily, the whispered commentary from the Hamilton family section gradually ceased, replaced by an uncomfortable silence as his words hit their intended target with devastating accuracy. He spoke about the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect, between social position and moral character, between appearing refined and actually being kind. His message was clear without being directly accusatory, but everyone in that cathedral understood exactly what behavior he was addressing and why it was completely unacceptable in any civilized gathering. The priest's words about sacrifice and dedication hit particularly hard as he described the kind of parent who gives up personal dreams and comforts to ensure their child has every possible opportunity for success and happiness. He painted a picture of late nights spent helping with homework after exhausting workdays, of choosing secondhand clothes for yourself so your child could have new school supplies, of celebrating every achievement with pride that comes from knowing you played a crucial role in making those accomplishments possible. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as Father O'Brien's words validated every sacrifice she had made, every difficult choice she had endured, and every moment when she had put Rachel's needs above her own desires and comfort. For the first time since entering that cathedral, she felt seen and valued by someone who understood that her worth was not determined by her clothing or her bank account, but by the depth of her love and the magnitude of her sacrifices for her daughter's success and happiness. My dear friends, I need to pause here for a moment because I can feel the emotion building in this story, and I know many of you are probably holding your breath right now, wondering how the Hamilton family is reacting to this unexpected confrontation with their own behavior. This is exactly why I love sharing these stories with all of you, because they remind us that sometimes, when we least expect it, someone steps forward to defend what's right and to call out behavior that damages the very foundation of human decency and respect. If this story is touching your heart the way it's touching mine, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right in a situation like this. I also want to hear your own stories about times when you faced judgment or exclusion, because your experiences matter and they help all of us feel less alone when we encounter these challenging moments. What other family drama stories would you like me to share? Your suggestions help shape the content I bring to this community, and I'm so grateful to have you here with me on this journey. The Hamilton family members were clearly struggling with how to respond to Father O'Brien's pointed commentary, caught between their desire to maintain their image as respectable community members and their obvious discomfort at being called out for behavior that revealed their true character. Patricia Hamilton's face had flushed red with embarrassment and anger, while Caroline looked as if she had been physically slapped by the priest's words about the difference between social position and moral worth. Thomas himself seemed to be hearing his family's behavior described clearly for the first time, and his expression showed growing shame and recognition as he realized how his relatives had been treating his new mother-in-law during what should have been a joyful celebration. Rachel, radiant in her wedding dress, looked confused by the unexpected turn in the ceremony, but her eyes found Margaret across the cathedral, and she smiled with the kind of love and gratitude that needed no explanation. Father O'Brien continued his homily by speaking about the true meaning of hospitality and welcome, about the moral obligation to treat guests with kindness and respect, and about the way we reveal our own character through how we treat people who cannot offer us anything in return. Father O'Brien's voice grew stronger and more passionate as he continued his unexpected sermon, speaking directly about the obligation that all people have to treat each other with dignity and respect regardless of their social or economic circumstances. He reminded the congregation that they were gathered in a house of worship, a place where worldly distinctions and material advantages should hold no meaning compared to the fundamental human worth that every person possesses simply by virtue of being created in God's image. His words carried the authority of someone who had spent decades counseling families, witnessing both the best and worst of human behavior, and understanding the deep spiritual damage that occurs when people allow pride and prejudice to corrupt their treatment of others. The priest spoke specifically about wedding ceremonies as sacred occasions that bring together different families and backgrounds in celebration of love's power to transcend boundaries and create new connections between people who might otherwise never have the opportunity to know and appreciate each other. He emphasized that when families come together for such occasions, they have a responsibility to demonstrate the very best of human nature, showing kindness, acceptance, and genuine interest in learning about the experiences and perspectives that each person brings to the expanded family circle. Father O'Brien's message about the true nature of family worth struck directly at the heart of the Hamilton family's behavior, as he described families whose value comes not from inherited wealth or social position, but from their commitment to supporting each other through challenges, celebrating each other's achievements, and maintaining unwavering loyalty even when circumstances are difficult. He painted a picture of family strength that had nothing to do with bank accounts or prestigious addresses, and everything to do with the depth of love and sacrifice that members were willing to make for each other's happiness and success. The priest's words about sacrifice resonated throughout the cathedral, as he spoke about parents who work multiple jobs to ensure their children can pursue their dreams, about the quiet heroism of people who go without luxuries so that their family members can have opportunities for education and advancement. He described the kind of love that shows itself through actions rather than words, through years of consistent dedication and support that often goes unrecognized by those who haven't experienced such selfless devotion from someone who puts their needs above everything else. Margaret felt a profound sense of validation and recognition as Father O'Brien continued to describe exactly the kind of parent she had been throughout Rachel's childhood and adolescence, working night shifts at the hospital so she could be available for school events and activities during the day, budgeting carefully so that Rachel could participate in extracurricular activities and educational opportunities that would enhance her college applications. The priest was honoring the invisible sacrifice that working parents make every day, acknowledging that true family strength comes from this kind of unwavering commitment to each other's well-being and success. As Father O'Brien's homily continued, he began to address the specific behavior he had witnessed during the ceremony, speaking about the spiritual emptiness that is revealed when people use their privileged position to mock and exclude others rather than to lift up and welcome those who might come from different circumstances. He spoke about the moral bankruptcy of people who mistake material advantage for personal superiority, who confuse inherited privilege with earned respect, and who demonstrate their own lack of character by treating guests with contempt and cruelty. The Hamilton family members were visibly uncomfortable as the priest's words hit their intended target with precision and moral authority. Carolyn shifted nervously in her seat, clearly recognizing that her whispered commentary and cruel observations were being addressed directly, while Patricia Hamilton stared straight ahead with a rigid posture that suggested she was struggling to maintain her composure under this unexpected public rebuke of her family's behavior. Thomas looked increasingly distressed as he began to understand the full extent of his family's treatment of Margaret, and Rachel's expression showed growing awareness that something significant was happening beyond the normal parameters of a wedding ceremony. The other wedding guests, many of whom had been oblivious to the Hamilton family's whispered campaign of exclusion, began to piece together what had prompted this unusual departure from traditional wedding homily topics. Father O'Brien spoke about the difference between true refinement and superficial sophistication, explaining that genuine class and breeding reveal themselves through kindness, empathy, and generosity toward others, particularly toward those who may be vulnerable or unfamiliar with certain social expectations. He contrasted this authentic refinement with the false sophistication that uses social knowledge as a weapon to exclude and diminish others, suggesting that such behavior reveals a poverty of spirit that no amount of wealth or social status can disguise. The priest's words about authentic versus artificial refinement struck particularly hard because they exposed the fundamental contradiction in the Hamilton family's self-image. They viewed themselves as representatives of sophisticated society, people who understood proper behavior and maintained high standards for themselves and their social circle. Yet their treatment of Margaret had demonstrated exactly the opposite qualities, revealing a coarseness and lack of basic human decency that contradicted everything they claimed to represent. Father O'Brien continued by speaking about the responsibility that comes with privilege, explaining that those who have been blessed with advantages in life have a moral obligation to use those blessings to lift up others rather than to create barriers and exclusions. He spoke about the way true leaders and genuinely refined people recognize and celebrate the achievements of others, particularly those who have overcome obstacles and challenges to reach their goals through hard work and determination. The message about responsibility and privilege seemed to hit Thomas particularly hard, as he began to see his family's behavior through the lens of moral obligation rather than social entitlement. He had grown up assuming that his family's wealth and position automatically conferred certain rights and privileges, including the right to judge and exclude people who didn't meet their standards. But Father O'Brien was challenging that assumption, suggesting that privilege actually created greater responsibility for treating others with kindness and respect. As the homily continued, Margaret felt a transformation occurring within herself, as if Father O'Brien's words were not only defending her worth, but also reminding her of strengths and qualities she had temporarily forgotten under the weight of the Hamilton family's relentless criticism and exclusion. The power of Father O'Brien's words began to shift the entire atmosphere in the cathedral, as his moral authority and spiritual insight cut through the superficial social dynamics that had been dominating the ceremony and revealed the deeper truths about character, worth, and the meaning of true family bonds. Margaret felt herself sitting straighter in her pew, her earlier shame and humiliation being replaced by a growing sense of dignity and pride in who she was and what she had accomplished through decades of hard work and sacrifice for her daughter's success and happiness. Father O'Brien spoke directly about the courage it takes to be a single parent, to shoulder all the responsibilities of raising a child while working demanding jobs and making countless personal sacrifices to ensure that child has every opportunity to succeed in life. He described the kind of strength required to maintain hope and determination during the most challenging times, when exhaustion and financial pressure could easily lead to despair. But love for a child provides the motivation to keep going and keep fighting for their future. The priest's words painted a vivid picture of the daily heroism displayed by working parents who come home from exhausting jobs and still find energy to help with homework, attend school events, and provide emotional support during difficult teenage years. He spoke about the quiet nobility of parents who wear second-hand clothes so their children can have new school supplies, who work extra shifts to pay for music lessons or sports equipment, who sacrifice their own dreams and comforts to ensure their children can pursue opportunities that were never available to them. As Father O'Brien continued his passionate defense of authentic family values, Margaret could see the Hamilton family members becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the clear moral judgment being delivered about their behavior. Their whispered commentary had completely ceased, replaced by intense silence as they realized that their treatment of Margaret had not gone unnoticed and was being addressed with the full authority of moral and spiritual leadership. The priest spoke about the way genuine refinement reveals itself through compassion and generosity toward others, particularly toward those who may be unfamiliar with certain social conventions, but who bring their own forms of wisdom, experience, and strength to family gatherings. He contrasted this authentic sophistication with the false refinement that uses social knowledge as a tool for exclusion and humiliation, suggesting that such behavior actually demonstrates a profound lack of breeding and character. Father O'Brien's message about true sophistication versus superficial snobbery resonated throughout the cathedral as he described families who understand that their strength comes from inclusion rather than exclusion, from celebrating diversity rather than demanding conformity, and from recognizing that every person brings unique gifts and perspectives that can enrich the family dynamic if they are welcomed with open hearts and genuine curiosity. The homily took an even more pointed turn as Father O'Brien began speaking about the spiritual emptiness that is revealed when people use their advantages in life to diminish others rather than to build them up. He described the moral bankruptcy of those who mistake material success for personal superiority, who confuse inherited privilege with earned respect, and who demonstrate their own lack of character by treating others with contempt based on superficial differences in social status or economic circumstances. Margaret felt tears of gratitude flowing down her cheeks as she realized that Father O'Brien was not only defending her dignity, but also honoring the sacrifices and struggles that had defined her adult life. His words validated every difficult choice she had made, every moment when she had put Rachel's needs above her own comfort, and every night when she had fallen asleep exhausted but satisfied, knowing that her hard work was creating opportunities for her daughter's success and happiness. The priest spoke about the divine nature of sacrificial love, explaining that parents who give up their own dreams and comforts to ensure their children can pursue their goals are participating in the most sacred form of human love, the kind of selfless devotion that reflects God's own love for humanity. He suggested that such sacrifice creates a form of nobility that cannot be purchased with money or inherited through family connections, but must be earned through years of consistent dedication and unwavering commitment to another person's well-being. Father O'Brien's words about sacrificial love seemed to awaken something in Thomas, who began looking at Margaret with new understanding and respect as he realized the magnitude of what she had given up to ensure Rachel could become the accomplished woman he had fallen in love with. The priest was helping him see that Margaret's modest appearance and humble circumstances were not sources of embarrassment, but evidence of the extraordinary love and dedication that had shaped Rachel's character and made her the remarkable person she had become. The Hamilton family's discomfort became increasingly obvious as Father O'Brien continued his moral reckoning, speaking about the responsibility that comes with being welcomed into a house of worship and the obligation to demonstrate the highest standards of human decency and compassion. He reminded the congregation that religious faith without kindness toward others is meaningless, that social position without moral character is worthless, and that true refinement reveals itself through how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. As the homily reached its crescendo, Father O'Brien spoke directly about the meaning of hospitality and welcome, about the sacred obligation to treat guests with kindness and respect, and about the way our treatment of others reveals our own spiritual condition and moral character. He emphasized that wedding ceremonies are particularly sacred occasions for demonstrating these values, as they bring together different families and backgrounds in celebration of love's power to create unity and understanding across all kinds of boundaries and differences. The priest's final words about hospitality and welcome struck the Hamilton family like a thunderbolt, as they realized that their behavior had violated the most basic principles of human decency and religious faith. turning what should have been a joyful celebration into an occasion for cruelty and exclusion that contradicted everything they claimed to believe about proper behavior and moral character. The conclusion of Father O'Brien's extraordinary homily left the cathedral in a state of profound silence, as if everyone present needed time to absorb the moral weight of what they had just witnessed and understand how dramatically the dynamics of the ceremony had shifted from superficial social positioning to deeper questions of character, worth, and human dignity. Margaret sat in her pew feeling transformed by the priest's words, no longer the isolated and humiliated outsider she had been 30 minutes earlier, but a woman whose sacrifices and love had been publicly honored and whose worth had been affirmed by the highest moral authority present. The Hamilton family members were clearly struggling to process what had just occurred, their comfortable assumptions about social hierarchy and appropriate behavior having been challenged by someone whose spiritual authority they could not dismiss or ignore. Patricia Hamilton's face showed a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and confusion as she realized that her family's treatment of Margaret had been publicly exposed and morally condemned by the very priest they had specifically chosen to officiate the ceremony because of his reputation and standing in their social circle. Caroline looked as if she had been physically struck by Father O'Brien's words about the difference between true refinement and superficial snobbery. Her earlier confidence in her superior social position having been replaced by the uncomfortable realization that her behavior had revealed exactly the kind of character flaws and moral emptiness that the priest had described with such devastating accuracy. The other Hamilton women who had participated in the whispered campaign of exclusion and mockery sat in stunned silence, unable to maintain their earlier sense of superiority in the face of such clear moral judgment. Thomas appeared deeply shaken by the priest's homily, as if he were seeing his family's behavior and his own assumptions about social worth through completely new eyes. The realization that his relatives had spent the morning mocking and excluding his new mother-in-law, the woman whose sacrifices had made Rachel's achievements possible, seemed to hit him with the force of a moral awakening that challenged everything he had been taught about class, privilege, and appropriate social behavior. Rachel stood at the altar, looking both confused and increasingly concerned as she began to piece together what had prompted Father O'Brien's unusual departure from traditional wedding homily topics. Her eyes found Margaret across the cathedral, and the look that passed between mother and daughter carried decades of shared love, mutual support, and the kind of unbreakable bond that no amount of social pressure or family disapproval could diminish or destroy. As the ceremony resumed following Father O'Brien's powerful intervention, the entire atmosphere in the cathedral had shifted dramatically. With the Hamilton family's earlier confidence and sense of social superiority, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that their behavior had been publicly exposed and morally condemned by someone whose authority they could neither dismiss nor challenge. Margaret felt a profound sense of vindication and restored dignity, no longer the isolated target of whispered insults, but a woman whose worth and sacrifices had been publicly recognized and honored by the spiritual leader officiating her daughter's wedding ceremony. The exchange of vows between Thomas and Rachel took on deeper meaning in the wake of Father O'Brien's homily, as both bride and groom seemed to understand that they were not merely joining their individual lives, but bringing together two families with very different values and approaches to treating others. Thomas's promises to love and honor Rachel carried new weight as he realized that truly honoring his wife would require him to also respect and value the woman who had sacrificed everything to make Rachel's success possible, regardless of what his family thought about social differences and appropriate behavior. Rachel's vows to Thomas included subtle but unmistakable references to the importance of family loyalty and standing up for the people who had supported her throughout her life, as if she were sending a clear message that her commitment to her new husband could not come at the expense of abandoning or diminishing the relationship with her mother. Her words carried the strength and determination that had helped her succeed in medical school, despite the financial challenges and social obstacles that could have derailed her dreams if she hadn't inherited Margaret's resilience and work ethic. The ring ceremony proceeded with a solemnity that reflected the deeper currents of tension and transformation flowing through the gathering. as guests on both sides of the aisle began to process what they had witnessed and understand how dramatically the social dynamics of the wedding had been altered by Father O'Brien's moral intervention. The Hamilton family members sat in rigid silence, their earlier whispered commentary replaced by an obvious discomfort as they realized that their treatment of Margaret had been observed and judged by others whose opinions they valued. Margaret watched her daughter exchange rings with Thomas, while feeling a complex mixture of emotions that ranged from overwhelming pride in Rachel's achievement to sadness about the way the Hamilton family had chosen to mark this joyful occasion with cruelty and exclusion rather than welcome and celebration. She realized that Rachel's marriage would likely involve ongoing challenges related to these family dynamics. But she also felt confident that her daughter possessed the strength and character necessary to navigate those difficulties while maintaining her own values and priorities. During the final blessing and pronouncement of marriage, Father O'Brien's eyes found Margaret across the cathedral, and his slight nod seemed to convey both solidarity with her experience and confidence that she would continue to handle these challenges with the same grace and dignity she had demonstrated throughout the ceremony. The priest understood that his intervention had helped level the playing field somewhat, but that the real work of building respectful family relationships would require ongoing effort from everyone involved, particularly from Thomas, as he learned to balance loyalty to his birth family with respect for his new wife's background and values. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle together, Margaret felt a surge of bittersweet emotion, watching Rachel beam with happiness, while knowing that the joy of this moment had been partially overshadowed by the Hamilton family's determination to treat her mother as an unwelcome intruder rather than a valued addition to their extended family circle. The contrast between Rachel's obvious love and pride in her mother and the Hamilton family's cruel dismissal of Margaret's worth created a tension that would likely continue to influence family gatherings and celebrations for years to come. The recessional music filled the cathedral as guests began to rise from their seats and prepare for the transition to the reception portion of the celebration. But the Hamilton family members moved with obvious reluctance and discomfort, clearly uncertain about how to interact with each other and with other guests after having their behavior so publicly exposed and criticized. Margaret noticed that several other wedding guests were looking at the Hamilton section with expressions that suggested they had pieced together what had prompted Father O'Brien's unusual homily and were forming their own judgments about the family's character and values. Patricia Hamilton made a visible effort to regain her composure and social confidence as she stood and began greeting other guests, but her interactions seemed forced and artificial compared to her earlier effortless command of social situations. The knowledge that her family's treatment of Margaret had been observed and condemned by Father O'Brien seemed to have shaken her fundamental confidence in her ability to navigate social situations with appropriate grace and authority. Caroline and the other Hamilton women who had participated in the whispered campaign against Margaret appeared particularly uncomfortable as they realized that their cruel commentary had not gone unnoticed, and that their behavior had revealed exactly the kind of character flaws and moral emptiness that Father O'Brien had described with such devastating accuracy. Their earlier sense of superiority and social confidence had been replaced by an awareness that they had failed to meet even the most basic standards of human decency and appropriate behavior. As the cathedral began to empty, Margaret remained in her seat for a few extra moments, allowing herself to process the emotional intensity of what she had experienced and to appreciate the unexpected support she had received from Father O'Brien. The priest's intervention had not only defended her dignity, but had also reminded her of her own worth and the value of the sacrifices she had made throughout Rachel's childhood and adolescence. When Margaret finally rose to leave her pew, she was approached by several other wedding guests who wanted to express their admiration for her grace under pressure and their disapproval of the Hamilton family's behavior. These were people from both sides of the wedding party who had witnessed the morning's events and felt moved to offer their support and solidarity with someone who had been treated unfairly but had maintained her dignity throughout the ordeal. The walk from the cathedral to the reception venue gave Margaret time to steel herself for what would likely be an equally challenging social situation, as the Hamilton family would presumably continue their efforts to exclude and diminish her while maintaining the appearance of appropriate celebration for their son's wedding. The reception hall was elegantly decorated with floral arrangements and lighting that created an atmosphere of celebration and sophistication. But Margaret entered the space knowing that the underlying tensions from the ceremony would likely continue to influence the social dynamics throughout the evening. She had hoped that Father O'Brien's intervention might have created an opportunity for the Hamilton family to reconsider their behavior and approach her with greater respect and kindness. But their rigid postures and obvious discomfort suggested that they were more concerned with maintaining their injured dignity than with examining their own conduct and making amends. Thomas and Rachel stood in the receiving line greeting guests as they entered the reception, and Margaret was touched by the extra warmth and attention that Rachel showed her, as if her daughter were trying to compensate for the earlier humiliation by demonstrating publicly how much she valued and appreciated her mother's presence at this celebration. Thomas also seemed to make an effort to interact with Margaret more respectfully than he had during their previous encounters, perhaps influenced by Father O'Brien's words about the importance of recognizing and honoring the sacrifices that had made Rachel's success possible. The seating arrangements for the reception dinner created another opportunity for the Hamilton family to demonstrate whether they had learned anything from the morning's moral reckoning. And Margaret was curious to see whether she would be placed at a table that honored her position as the bride's mother, or relegated to some distant corner where her presence would be less visible to the other guests. When she found her assigned seat at a table near the front of the room, close to the head table where Thomas and Rachel would be dining, she felt a small sense of victory and recognition that suggested someone had overruled whatever exclusionary impulses might have originally influenced the seating arrangements. Margaret's tablemates included several family friends from Rachel's childhood, people who had known about her struggles as a single mother, and who had witnessed firsthand the sacrifices she had made to ensure her daughter could pursue her dreams of becoming a doctor. Their warm welcome and obvious admiration for what she had accomplished provided a stark contrast to the Hamilton family's cruel treatment, reminding Margaret that her worth was not determined by the opinions of people who had never bothered to learn about her character or appreciate her contributions to Rachel's success. As the reception dinner progressed, Margaret noticed that the Hamilton family members were making deliberate efforts to avoid any direct interaction with her, maintaining their physical and social distance while engaging enthusiastically with other guests who met their standards for appropriate social connection. Their behavior suggested that Father O'Brien's intervention had not inspired any genuine reflection or remorse, but had simply made them more careful about expressing their prejudices and exclusionary attitudes in public settings where they might be overheard and criticized. The speeches during the reception dinner provided another test of whether the morning's events had created any positive change in family dynamics, and Margaret listened carefully as various Hamilton family members rose to offer their thoughts about the marriage and their hopes for the couple's future together. Thomas's father spoke at length about his son's achievements and promising career prospects, but made no mention of Rachel's own accomplishments or the family background that had shaped her into the remarkable woman Thomas had chosen to marry. Patricia Hamilton's speech focused primarily on the social advantages and opportunities that the marriage would create for both families. Speaking about shared values and common goals without acknowledging that different backgrounds and experiences could actually strengthen a family by bringing diverse perspectives and forms of wisdom to important decisions and challenges. Her words seemed calculated to emphasize the Hamilton family's superior social position rather than to genuinely welcome Margaret and celebrate the joining of two families with different but equally valuable contributions to offer. When Thomas rose to speak about his new wife, Margaret felt hopeful that he might use the opportunity to acknowledge her role in Rachel's success and to demonstrate the kind of respect and appreciation that Father O'Brien had emphasized during his homily. Thomas did speak warmly about Rachel's intelligence, dedication, and compassion, but his comments remained focused on her individual qualities rather than recognizing the family support and sacrifice that had made her achievements possible. Rachel's response speech, however, provided the emotional highlight of the evening for Margaret, as her daughter spoke directly and powerfully about the woman who had raised her and the sacrifices that had made this day possible. Rachel thanked Margaret publicly for working multiple jobs to pay for her education, for believing in her dreams when others suggested they were unrealistic, and for modeling the kind of strength and determination that had carried Rachel through the most challenging aspects of medical school and residency training. The daughter's heartfelt tribute to her mother created a moment of profound silence in the reception hall as guests absorbed the magnitude of what Margaret had accomplished as a single parent and began to understand why Father O'Brien had felt compelled to defend her dignity during the wedding ceremony. Rachel's words painted a vivid picture of late nights spent studying together, of Margaret picking up extra shifts at the hospital to pay for test prep courses and application fees, and of the unwavering emotional support that had sustained Rachel through the most difficult periods of her education and training. Margaret felt tears of pride and gratitude flowing down her cheeks as Rachel continued her speech, describing how her mother's example had taught her that true success comes not from inherited advantages, but from hard work, perseverance, and dedication to goals that matter. Rachel spoke about the values Margaret had instilled in her, including the importance of treating all people with respect and kindness regardless of their social or economic circumstances, and the obligation to use whatever advantages you gain in life to help others achieve their own dreams and aspirations. The power of Rachel's tribute seemed to create a shift in the reception's emotional atmosphere, as guests began to see Margaret through her daughter's eyes rather than through the lens of superficial social judgments and class-based prejudices. Several people approached Margaret after the speeches to express their admiration for what she had accomplished and to share their own stories about overcoming challenges through hard work and family support. The remainder of the reception unfolded with a notably different energy than the morning ceremony, as Rachel's powerful tribute to her mother had effectively reframed the social dynamics and forced even the most reluctant guests to acknowledge Margaret's worth and the magnitude of her contributions to her daughter's success. The Hamilton family members continued to maintain their distance, but their earlier active hostility had been replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that their behavior had been publicly exposed and that continuing to mock or exclude Margaret would only further damage their own reputations and social standing among the other wedding guests. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself engaged in meaningful conversations with people from both sides of the wedding party who were genuinely interested in learning about her experiences as a single mother and her perspective on Rachel's journey to becoming a doctor. These interactions reminded her that the Hamilton family's cruel judgment was not representative of how most decent people respond when they encounter someone whose life story differs from their own background and circumstances. The dancing portion of the reception provided another opportunity for family dynamics to play out in public, and Margaret watched with interest to see whether Thomas would extend the courtesy of asking her to dance or whether the Hamilton family's commitment to excluding her would persist even during the celebratory portions of the evening. When the time came for the traditional family dances, Thomas did approach Margaret and politely requested a dance, though his manner suggested obligation rather than genuine warmth or respect. During their brief dance, Thomas made what appeared to be an attempt at reconciliation, acknowledging that the morning's events had been unfortunate and expressing hope that their families could find common ground despite their different backgrounds and perspectives. However, his comments seemed more focused on managing the social awkwardness than on genuinely understanding why his family's behavior had been inappropriate and hurtful, and Margaret sensed that he was primarily concerned with maintaining appearances rather than addressing the underlying attitudes that had created the conflict. Rachel's dance with her mother, in contrast, was filled with emotion and genuine affection, as daughter and mother shared a moment of connection and mutual appreciation that transcended all the social tensions and family drama that had marked the day. During their dance, Rachel quietly thanked Margaret for handling the morning's difficulties with such grace and dignity, and she promised that she would never allow anyone, including her new husband's family, to treat her mother with disrespect or cruelty. The conversation between mother and daughter during their dance revealed that Rachel had been more aware of her in-laws' behavior than Margaret had realized, and that she was prepared to set clear boundaries about how her mother would be treated in future family gatherings and social situations. Rachel's fierce loyalty and protective instincts reminded Margaret of all the reasons she had been willing to sacrifice so much for her daughter's success, and she felt confident that their relationship would remain strong regardless of whatever challenges the Hamilton family might create in the future. As the reception wound down and guests began to leave, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary events of the day and the unexpected ways in which Father O'Brien's intervention had transformed what could have been a completely devastating experience into a moment of moral clarity and personal vindication. While the Hamilton family had not undergone any genuine conversion or change of heart, their behavior had been publicly exposed and condemned, and Margaret had been reminded of her own worth and the value of the sacrifices she had made throughout Rachel's childhood and adolescence. The drive home from the reception gave Margaret time to process the emotional intensity of the day and to consider what lessons she could draw from the experience about human nature, family dynamics, and the importance of standing up for dignity and respect, even in the most challenging social situations. She realized that Father O'Brien's courage in speaking truth to power had not only defended her personally, but had also demonstrated the kind of moral leadership that could inspire others to examine their own behavior and treat people with greater kindness and consideration. Margaret understood that her relationship with the Hamilton family would likely remain complicated and potentially difficult, but she felt confident that she had established her right to be treated with basic respect and courtesy, and that Rachel would continue to defend their relationship against any future attempts at exclusion or marginalization. The experience had also strengthened her appreciation for the genuine friendships and supportive relationships in her own life, people who valued her for who she was rather than judging her based on superficial social criteria. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone unexpectedly stood up for you in a situation where you felt powerless and alone? Have you witnessed the kind of casual cruelty that the Hamilton family displayed, where people use their social advantages to diminish and exclude others? Margaret's story reminds us that dignity cannot be taken away from us by other people's behavior, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge to defend what is right and just. Her experience also shows us the profound impact that one person's moral courage can have in transforming difficult situations and revealing the true character of everyone involved. In the weeks and months following Rachel's wedding, the story of Father O'Brien's intervention and Margaret's grace under pressure became something of a legend in their community, inspiring other people to speak up against exclusion and discrimination, while also serving as a reminder that true refinement reveals itself through kindness and empathy, rather than through cruelty and social snobbery. Margaret's dignity throughout the ordeal, combined with the priest's moral courage, created a powerful example of how ordinary people can stand up to injustice and defend human worth in the face of prejudice and privilege. Thank you for joining me on Margaret's incredible journey through one of the most challenging and ultimately transformative days of her life. Her story reminds us that our worth is not determined by other people's opinions or judgments, and that sometimes the most powerful victories come not from fighting back against cruelty, but from maintaining our dignity and allowing others to reveal their true character through their actions. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own experiences with judgment and exclusion, please stay connected with our community by clicking on one of the videos appearing on your screen right now to continue exploring these important themes of family, respect, and the courage to stand up for what is right.